In 2014, I started my podcast called Logistikpodden, the logistics podcast in Swedish. I've now been doing it for 9 years, and I'm about to wrap up this podcast during its 10th and final year. And a year from now, that podcast will, of course, continue to be available in the back catalog. And you can listen to all some 350-ish episodes. But I want to do something extra. I want this podcast to get a second life in the form of an AI model. Now, I've done coding before, but I stopped when Visual Basic turned into visualbasic.net because I'm not a formally trained coder and developer. I'm self-taught, and the paradigm shift to go into something more structured and actually better than Visual Basic was not something I was prepared to do the heavy lifting to achieve at the time. And this was in 2009, I think, something like that. So I haven't been doing much developing since then. And I've always wanted to learn Python because Python is the language of AI, but I've never gotten around to actually learn it. And now, since we have ChatGPT, I don't actually have to learn Python. I can have this language model generate the code I want as long as I prompt it in the right way. So I want to train or fine-tune a large language model on the entire content of my podcast. And I want that model to be ready to take over a year from now when the podcast's last episode is published. Now, I don't want the simple chatbot Googling, if you will, into the podcast and feeding back results. I want it to be smarter than that. I want to have an interface to the hundreds of people I've been interviewing throughout the years in the podcast. For instance, I would like to simulate a panel or a debate between 3 separate guests who may have never met, but I have them recorded and I have their knowledge distilled inside the podcast. So I would like to simulate a debate on circularity between 3 experts, for instance. Or I would like to get the essence of a specific topic, even if it has been mentioned in passing 20 different times during the years in the podcast. I would like that to be readily available for me as a user for further research or to go deeper into it. So it's not only a chatbot looking at the content of the podcast, it's also a channel to find the right maybe audio clippings to listen to get the context, or to dig deeper into the material. I have very few ideas on how to manage this. I have 1 year, and I know that technology will develop during this 1 year to make this possible, to do it without actually having to be a developer. So I'm going to, in this YouTube channel, document that journey. And that learning experience. I've just now started doing simple transcriptions of the episodes, but that's something that I know I will have to do again and maybe again and again before they're good enough to train this model that I have envisioned. So this is the introduction video, just telling you about this project that will consume some of my time during 2024. And hopefully I will learn a lot doing this, and hopefully you will learn something by watching me and watching and learning from my mistakes, because I will make tons of mistakes. But I'm convinced that this is possible. It is possible to create a digital version of my podcast that is actually better than the podcast, because it will then be able to speak in hundreds of languages. And you will be able to converse with it. And to be frank, I have forgotten almost all of my episodes. I may remember some bits and pieces of single episodes, but if you ask me to recall what was said 6 years ago during an interview, I cannot, of course, do that. But now we have this amazing tool at our fingertips, so I'm going to try to make the most of it. To train a model and a chatbot on a 10-year podcast and to see if that will add more value to the listeners and to anyone who wants to interact with it, and to me, of course. So please subscribe if you want to join me on this journey, because this is something that was impossible just a short while ago, and now it will become commonplace. And I'm sure that in 2 or 3 years, this will be the standard way of making sure that we do not lose old knowledge and we can preserve old insights as something that we can almost physically interact with going into the future. So this is an experiment. I want to learn, but I also want to create the best continued version of my podcast that I can, because these 10 years have been fantastic and I have learned tons, and I want that to be preserved going into the future. So if you're as intrigued by this as I am, please hit subscribe and let's do this journey together.